at the Boston, the local meetups. Back when I lived on the East Coast, I used to live in a little town called Norwalk, Connecticut, and I used to come up occasionally to Boston for work. And if there was a scenario where I could present at a meetup, I definitely would do that. But yeah, so my name is Isaac Levin. I think Bill did a really, really good job of introducing me, so I will not bore you with the gritty details. What we're going to talk about is App Insights. These are my social handles. If you do want to follow me, I do stream on Twitch as well. That's not listed here, but I think one of the things that I just want to call out a few things. So I used to work at Microsoft, so if folks might know me from there. If you've heard my name before, I used to work at Microsoft. Now I work at a company called Elastic, which specializes, in my opinion, in probably the best search out there. Lots of companies use it. Even companies have built other search products using Elastic technology. So what I do is I run up marketing for a product they have there. I'm also the chairman, or not the chairman, the chair of the marketing committee for the .NET Foundation. So if you feel like you have a passion for .NET and you really want to make .NET better, join the foundation, whether you're a member paying dues or part of one of the committees. The marketing committee is always looking for people to chat with and have great conversations about how we could do better with the foundation and .NET in general. So yeah, so let's get to the real meat of it, right? So quick thing. This is not supposed to be me talking for 45 minutes to an hour by myself. If you want to come off mute, if you want to use some of the cool emojis that exist inside of Teams, please feel free to do so. I can't imagine listening to myself for 45 minutes to an hour, so I please beg of you to give your colleagues a little break with maybe your voice or just some conversation as well. So before I start talking about what App Insights is and the value proposition it is, I just want to get a quick test of the room, and do people know what telemetry is? So I'm going to say this phrase or this word a lot through our conversation today. So whether you want to come off mute and say it, or if you want to drop in the chat what you think telemetry is, because I'm going to be talking about it a lot, I want to make sure there's a pretty good grasp of what the term means. Cool. There's silence. All right, so that's fine. So what telemetry basically is, in a nutshell, is it's collecting data on an instrument. It's typically used in the physical world, but when we talk about telemetry, it also means what is the data that our applications create, not the data they leverage, whether that's data in a SQL database or in MongoDB or Cosmos or some other non-relational data store, but like the actual data that your app creates. So for instance, CPU utilization, error messages, stack traces, miscellaneous logs that exist, whenever you use some login providers, right? So this is stuff that your application creates, and you don't especially leverage it by default. And this is an opportunity for us to talk about how we can leverage it better by default. So I'm going to be talking about telemetry a lot. And when you think about telemetry, it's just the app or the data that your applications create. All right, so moving on. So we have a quick poll here. Please put thumbs up in the chat or use emojis. So who here writes web apps? Anybody? Does anybody write web apps here? All right. Yeah, it looks like some people are write web apps. That's great. So client server both. I think for the most part, in this day and age, if you work in .NET, you've done some development in the web space. So apps deployed to the cloud, right? So who here has the opportunity of deployed their apps to, different cloud providers? Obviously, the one from Microsoft probably being the most notable, especially for this group. But who also is deploying their stuff just on-prem, just servers that exist in their local infrastructure? Great, great. And who uses an existing APM? Application Performance Management Utility. So some really, really well-known products out there. New Relic, AtDynamics, Elastic, the company I work for, also has an observability platform. Who has used these in the past? Awesome. So when we talked about telemetry earlier and kind of the data that your application produces, who has used telemetry collection mechanisms? There's a handful of great packages that exist for .NET, nlog, log4net. Who have used those? All right. And who here knows about App Insights? Hopefully some people know about it. Otherwise, I don't think there's any real reason to come to this talk other than to maybe learn more. Okay. So as we get started, I want to just think about some rhetorical questions, some questions that I feel like after this talk we'll have a better understanding of how we could potentially answer them. I'm not going to go through all of these, obviously. I think one of the things we really want to come out of it is that how can we bring value to folks? Whether that being, get an understanding of where our apps are being used all over the world. Like if you have a web app, you obviously can have customers all over the world. What are the areas of our application that are being used frequently and unfrequently, right? Do we have an opportunity to better our user experience based on some data? What is App Insights? So App Insights, in its wholest form, is the application arm of Azure Monitor, which is the monitoring or observability platform that's built inside of Azure. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to collect all that data that I've been talking about and store it in Azure for a place for you to be able to query and gather insights from. And App Insights, it supports a plethora of different technologies, right? Obviously, in a Microsoft world, if there's not great .NET support, there's probably something to be concerned about there. But there's also existing managed packages for Java, for Node, regular static JavaScript, which includes HTML and CSS, and Application Insights in its purest form, it's a set of REST APIs. So there are a handful of different, deployments or developments that have existed that use App Insights. Whether that's a desktop application or Python or PHP, WordPress. There's some really great examples out there on the internet of using different technologies to consume App Insights. When I talked about what kind of telemetry, right, the Application Insights collects, and this is by default, right? I want to be 100% clear. If you light up App Insights today, you will get all of this telemetry being collected by default for your application. So things like request response data, right? So being able to see load times and routes and all that sort of really important information. Dependencies, so any of the things that aren't in your app that your app consumes, whether that be SQL or Azure storage or anything else, reg caching. Page views and load time, this gives you the ability to get a better understanding of where users are coming from and their experiences as they use the web application of your site. User information, not PII or personable identifiable information, but information that can really help glean, what kind of users are using your application. Exceptions, so being able to see things like stack traces, error messages, things like that. Performance data, like I mentioned a bit earlier, CPU, RAM, network. And one really interesting thing about App Insights is that the structure for it is non-structured JSON. So what that means is that you can actually send any sort of data to App Insights for it to collect, and those are called custom metrics. And we'll talk about a little bit about that in a little bit, but just think about business data or domain data that your application might look to leverage that you want to include as a part of some of the things that you're doing with App Insights. This is an overall flow of what App Insights actually does. I think this is really, really valuable. I stole this from the docs.microsoft.com section of App Insights. So everything on the left-hand side are kind of the things that your application collects, right? Whether that's information, HTTP requests from your web apps or dependency calls from external services, it sends them through an API call into App Insights, which is that big purple box in the middle. And on the right-hand side, all the different ways that you can expose App Insights data for yourself and for your customers. Okay, well, I'm interested. So it's got to be super expensive, right? You're talking about collecting all this data, giving me all those great insights. Like there has to be a pretty good price tag. No, it's pretty cost effective at scale, right? So when we talk about what the pricing is for App Insights, it's 5 gigabytes of ingress and outgress data. So that means data going into App Insights and data coming out of App Insights of up to 5 gigabytes per month. And if you need more than that, it's $2.30 per gigabyte per month. You also have some additional things like multi-web step tests, and ping tests that are available depending on your needs. One thing to call out is that by default, it says 90 days of data retention. So that means how long your data stays in App Insights. Well, you can actually configure this up to 2 years in the Azure portal. So in the situation where you do need historical data, you have up to 2 years of that you can store. And one thing that's really, really great about App Insights, it's free to use for POCs. Say, for instance, you're at a company and you want to take advantage of App Insights, but you might be concerned about the price point or things like that. I can rest assured, more than likely, you're not going to go over 5 gigabytes per instance of App Insights per month, just doing a POC. And then obviously, if you have a web application in production that's using it over time, yes, you might need to scale to over 5 gigs. But like I said, it's fairly cost effective. And like I mentioned, you can have multiple App Insights resources in your Azure subscription, and they don't all use that 5 gigabytes. They all each have 5 gigabytes to use. All right, so it's got to be complicated, right? Turning all this stuff on, lighting up all these different things to be able to collect all those different kinds of telemetry. Well, obviously, it's not very challenging. So there's a handful of ways to set up App Insights, and I like to use kind of two canonical personas, right? So there's the individual who has access to the code base, aka they're a developer, or maybe they're somebody who just has access to the code base to make configuration changes. There's that individual, and there's the individual that doesn't have the code at all, and they can't modify the code, they can't deploy the code again to their environment. Maybe their source code is gone for whatever reason. So both those personas have options in Survive App Insights, and depending on where your app is hosted, it can get even easier. So the easiest way is you can enable the App Insights extension on Azure App Service directly. So in the situation where you have your application already hosted in Azure using App Service, you have the ability easily to go and click on the purple banner or click on that little App Insights box. And that's going to take you through a wizard. And that wizard is basically going to say, turn on the site extension. I'll do that. It's going to ask you to configure a location and resource group for your App Insights resource to be created. And then once that's done, it creates the resource, and then your application, your web app, is actually wired up to send telemetry data to that. That's it. Nothing else you need to do. Obviously, that's the quickest scenario. You don't have all of the, I guess you could say, full fidelity experience with App Insights, like being able to add custom metrics and things like that. But out of the box, you're able to collect a lot of telemetry right away, which I think is super valuable. So if you don't have the code, that's an option for you. If you do have the code, you can use your favorite IDE. You can use Visual Studio to actually configure App Insights locally, just right there from within Visual Studio. So you right-click on a project, you click on Application Insights Telemetry, or you click Add, and then Application Insights Telemetry. It'll take you through a wizard of setting up the App Insights resource in Azure, or you can actually do it locally as well if you want. And then after that, you have 3 green bars of success. You have the SDK that's been added, your application has been registered, and published annotations have been configured, which allows some really, really interesting data to be sent through to when Application Insights ingest some of those things like exceptions. Finally, don't have the code, not in Azure. What can I do? So you can actually take advantage of App Insights as well from on-prem IIS using a PowerShell module that exists called Application Insights Status Monitor. So like I said, this is a PowerShell module. It's coolest instrumentation of .NET Web Apps hosted on IIS. So basically, it's PowerShell commands that allow you to instrument your apps that have already been built. So these are built binary applications. So just DLLs, or maybe some exe files and some configuration files, right? And that allows you to instrument them in a way that allows you to get some of those features that we were talking about earlier. So like I said, there's a handful of different options depending on what your scenario is. And one of the things I want to do when I showcase this demo right here is that I want to point out, it's not just like the newest versions of .NET, right? So I know a lot of people probably think, oh, this is probably only available for like .NET 5 or .NET 6, right? This is my web app. It makes me a lot of money. Like, as you can tell, it's hosted in Azure, It's got great UX experience. It's written in .NET Framework 4.7.2. I need this app for my business to run effectively. And one of the things that I think is really, really important to call out, it's hosted in Azure, yes, but it's .NET Framework. So I want to be able to get some better gleanings of telemetry from this application. So what I can actually do here is I can actually open up my web app in Visual Studio. So as you can see here, this is the .NET Framework way of doing things. So there's a global ASX file and web.config, and there's all these things like app data and app start, these things that honestly I haven't looked at in probably 3 or 4 years. But I really want to show you that you can light up App Insights for .NET Framework applications as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to right click on web application. And then I'm going to, configure application insights. And then after that, it's going to ask me a couple of questions. It's going to say, do you want to configure application insights locally? Or do you want to actually spin it up and use Azure, right? So you have 2 options here, right? So I'm just going to say, I want to do it in Azure. So I click next. And that's going to reach out and look at my different environments. And I'm going to pick web application here, which is the name of my App Insights resource that already exists. I'm going to click next. I'm going to specify that connection string in here. Click next. And then it's going to tell me what it's actually doing, right? So as you can see here, oh man, I'm losing it today. So there we go. So it NuGet packages, updates some project properties, puts some stuff in the store, puts stuff in settings. So basically it lights up your app for you. I click finish here, and that's going to actually do that. It's going to add some dependencies to our application, and then it's going to add some settings to our configuration variables. And then after that, we're going to basically have an environment that's lit up with App Insights right out of the box. And then I can deploy this to Azure, and then my application that makes me a lot of money that's written in .NET Framework, it's still going to work, and it's still going to have all these great things tied to it. So I can just show you here. So as you can see, let's just zoom in. So there's a handful of Microsoft.ai and Microsoft Application Insights, right? So these are these NuGet packages that were added to our application in order for it to run successfully. There's also some changes that were added to our web.config, right? So like there's some secrets information, there's telemetry correlation, HTML module. These are things that allow us to actually work with App Insights in the .NET Framework world. And then after that, it's just a deployment and things are good to go. So that's really, really, really cool. But there's probably more interesting scenarios, right? So I'm going to close out of Visual Studio here, and I'm going to open up a different application. Let me just close some tabs here. As my computer is starting to get really, really slow for some reason. All right. Go away. Go away, Teams thing.
We have a couple of questions in the chat.
Sure. Oh wow, there's lots of questions. Okay, we can take a second and answer some of these. Let's scroll up to the top. Catherine Moss. If I understand how it works, App Insights is somewhat like the DevOps Monitor Sentry, except the latter is on premise versus in Azure. That is correct, right? So Sentry actually is an APM as well. And the only real difference between, whether it's Elastic Observability or New Relic or App Dynamics is where the data is actually hosted. In Sentry world, you can specify, an agent that's, somewhere in your environment that stores that data. App Insights, the data is just stored in Azure. So pretty solid. So can this also be used in a hybrid environment where Azure is set up along with your on-premise stuff? I just showed using the App Insights Status Monitor, you can actually light up on-prem non-Azure instances of your web apps to actually send data out there. The data sits in Azure though, so I want to be 100% clear. So if you're not using Azure today, it might be in your best interest to look at other options. But if you're already in Azure and some of your apps are in Azure, some of your apps are on-prem, take advantage of App Insights, and the greater Azure Monitor umbrella could help you out a lot there.
Now, does that work for other stuff? So like you mentioned about exe files and DLLs, but what about like PHP and Python? Because a lot of my stuff is on like WordPress and a bunch of other random stuff.
Yep, like I mentioned earlier, right? So there are libraries that exist for a plethora of different technologies, not just .NET. So PHP, Python, I believe there is a WordPress one, regular JavaScript, Node.
I will have to play with that, I think. That's going to be fun.
All right, so moving on. What is the recommended deployment scenario? Do you deploy one instance of App Insights per, say, a region, or do you deploy it to a specific workload? It's definitely workload based, Jeff. And so, one example that I see a lot is depending on environment, right? So you have an application that has 3 environments, has like test, staging, and production. You can have different App Insights resources for each of those different environments, and that way your telemetry is separated out, and you have that ability to granularly look at different scenarios. One also thing that's great about App Insights is there's this concept called distributed tracing, which allows you to connect lots of different resources all into one App Insights centralized resource, and then you can see, and I'll show what that looks like in a second, kind of like the dependency flow between all these different applications, and that's really, really powerful. All right, what else do we got here? Adding App Insights to app service does trigger an app restart the one time. That's good. That's a good call out. If you do go down the path of doing a deployment, or you do anything in the Azure portal, usually in configuration for an app service, you do need to restart. So it is one of those things that if you do decide to do it, make sure that you have some maintenance schedule, or you notify your user that your site's going to be going down for an app restart, which can be a little bit, roughly probably like a minute or so for it to come back, or quicker. What is the recommended setup for an app that has dev QA prod? I mentioned that a little bit, Jason. I think that it's kind of your mileage may vary. I personally like to have different App Insights resources per environment, just because it gives me the flexibility and it allows me to leverage that 5 free gigabytes a month, right? That's one of the things I want to call out. If you're just playing around with this stuff, you definitely don't want to be paying for it. So, all right. Currently spread over a few resource groups. You currently use one. We like the nice data separation. That's a great call out, Howard. I really appreciate the commentary there. I think the recommended by Microsoft for a microservice setting is to use one AI for each. I think AI can still create application map spanning. That's right. I was talking about distributed tracing a little bit ago, and that's the exact use case, right? So say, for instance, you have a Kubernetes cluster, or you have a handful of different Azure functions, and you want them to all wire up into one holistic topology of what your apps are doing and the different data sources they're using. You can leverage distributed tracing for that. And one thing as well that's really important to call out about App Insights is that now it's being rolled up into the broader open telemetry principles that exist in technology right now. So a lot of companies notably Google, are building on top of this concept of open telemetry. So the same schema for all of your different telemetry points. And that way it allows you to get better fidelity across different services, right? So there might be a day in the future where you can have some data that sits in some proprietary service and one that sits in App Insights, and they can actually see the data flow between them using any sort of tool, which would be really, really valuable for a lot of folks. All right. Any other questions before I move on? Sweet. All right.
I just added one. So
costs. Are we saying that multiple instances of App Insights, say blah blah blah, is cheaper? Well, so you have 5 gigabytes per month per resource. So if you have one resource that uses 20 gigabytes, you're going to pay money for that.
And but one resource is one instance of App Insights. I'm sorry, I overtalked you. I'm sorry. One resource is one App Insights instance?
Correct.
Oh, thank you. You just saved us a lot of money.
Well, so I'll definitely take a consulting fee.
Okay.
All right, cool.
Suggesting cool. That, say, for a scenario of a K8 cluster plus like 4 app services, you might say, plus like the infrastructure itself that writes, like say, storage accounts, IoT hubs, stuff like that. How would you see that as like 5 instances, say?
I mean, so in a situation where you're talking about, I would just make sure that obviously test that in a lower environment and see if you're still seeing that holistic topology, right? So if you have 5 or 6 services in a cluster and they're all talking to each other, you want to make sure that the data flow, telemetry data flow is good between all of them. So make sure that works correctly. Make sure that distributed tracing is going through. And obviously, Microsoft has great documentation on how to monitor Kubernetes apps, app data with Kubernetes clusters as well. So make sure you're following, those recommendations.
Thank you.
Oh, all right. Going once, going twice. All right, moving on. So I want to show something a little bit more interesting, right? So this is a .NET 6 application using Angular version, what day is today? Angular version 603. This application, just kidding, there's only, I think, like 12 versions of Angular. But this application basically is a .NET 6 preview backend hosted in Azure with a Angular front end. So it's, as you can see, it uses the, if anybody has learned Angular in the past, this is very, very similar to people. This is like the Tour of Heroes canonical app that exists for Angular apps. So as you can see here, I can hop around and look at different things. I even have search. So if I search, but my search isn't working. So we'll need to figure out what's going on there. That's strange. But as you can see here, if I go over, this is my application. It's wired up with App Insights. So I can click on the App Insights blade and I can look at some of the things that have been going on for this particular app. So what I'm going to do is show you what this app looks like in Visual Studio. So come over here. So don't be scared. This is the new .NET 6 templates. So a lot of stuff that you're probably used to seeing when you write C# isn't there anymore. This isn't a talk about that. I do other talks about .NET 6 and what's coming out and all that sort of crazy stuff. But now things like startup.cs are no longer required for .NET 6. You can do all that stuff inside of one application in one file called programs.cs. There's no more namespaces. There's no more classes. It's just all the way down an application. Cool. All right. So this application, it's wired up with App Insights here. So as you can see, App Insights telemetry. And one of the things that's really, really cool is I can actually start this app here. Let's set .NET 6 as my startup project. And then here. So if I click this, and I apologize, this might take a second because there's some Angular stuff going on too. But basically what this is it's an Angular app, and with a .NET 6 backend. And once I click that button, what you can see here is App Insights showed up automatically, right? So super, super cool. And I want to show you some other cool things that I can do in a second, right? Let's hop back over to the presentation, but I just want to show you App Insights lighting up for .NET 6 applications. It's as easy as one line of code and adding a NuGet package, right? All right. So back to the slides. Minimize this, minimize that, minimize that. All right. Any questions before we kind of move on to the next thing, which is talking about different ways to use that data? Sweet. All right. So different ways we can consume the data. So we're in Azure, so we have access to all sorts of cool things that exist in Azure already, right? So like dashboards. So you can easily create a dashboard from your App Insights resource that creates something like this for you. So being able to see all of the really high fidelity information about your app in one page is really, really valuable. I also talked about like this topological view of what our applications are doing, and something like App Map allows you to be able to successfully see that. So as you can see, this application hits a database, it hits an Azure queue, it hits some other service, it hits another database. Like being able to see everything from like one top down and all the different requests and what their timing is really, really valuable. So another really, really cool thing about App Insights is that you have the ability to look at profile data. So being able to look down by execution path, like where your application is slowing down, and being able to get a better understanding of ways that you can add more efficiencies and look at percentiles and say, why is my app in certain scenarios running so slow? Maybe it's a region issue, or maybe my code isn't really effective in certain scenarios, right? So being able to see that at a glance is really helpful. One thing I love about Azure is the ability to create like these really rich visualizations, right? I'm not a data designer, so being able to do these things really, really quickly has saved me lots of time and headache. So it's another cool thing you can take advantage of. I'll show this in a little bit, but you can actually see data in real time coming across the wire to App Insights. So one thing that I didn't mention that should be called out is that there is a little bit of an ingest period for App Insights data. So from the time that you send it to the API to the time that you actually see it in the Azure portal is roughly 90 seconds. That's how long it takes to get sent through all of the ingestion process, which includes some machine learning and insights, instructions, and things like that. But if you need to see in real time what your app is doing, you have the ability to do it with a live metric stream. So you can easily, like in real time, glance at like the usage of your application, which I think is super impactful. You can export all the things in App Insights to Power BI. So, and again, like being able to satisfy the needs of business users with reports is really valuable. And not having to leverage, data designers and other folks is super impactful. You can take a look at App Insights in Visual Studio too. So like when you have a local environment going, you can actually see some of the different telemetry points of your app while it's running inside of Visual Studio. And you can actually connect it to Azure as well. Continuous export. When I mentioned a little bit earlier that you can store your data up to 2 years, that might not be long enough, right? So you might want to be able to look at historical data over time. Maybe if you have particular web traffic data and things like that. So continuous export allows you to take that JSON data that exists for App Insights and send it to a blob store. And then once it's in a blob store, it's just flat JSON files that you can do whatever you want with it forever. So a way for you to get, that historical data that's really, really invaluable. So I want to show a couple of different cool things you can do using App Insights. So I'm going to go back into Visual Studio here. Let me just open this up. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, I have that app running. So here's that app. It's local, so as you can see, it's just localhost here. And I want to, and since this app's been running for a little bit, I have App Insights wired up that it shows actually in Visual Studio when I'm debugging. And inside of here, I can actually take a look and say like, okay, like in the last 30 minutes, like what's all the data that's been created, right? So as you can see here, like there's some really interesting information. So there's some dependency data. So it looks like I'm hitting some dependencies. I can actually take a look at requests as well. So like this is stuff that you can actually see when you're playing around with App Insights before you actually take the step in deploying it to Azure. So I can actually take my app, I can light it up with App Insights locally, just installing the SDKs, and then I get this experience, and I can say like, oh, at a glance, like this is the sort of data that my app will be producing and be storing in Azure. So that's super impactful. I'm going to stop this really quick, and I'm going to go back to my Azure portal for a second. I'm going to close that. All right. So as you can see here, so this is the main blade for App Insights for this particular instance. And as you can see here, I have things like App Map, which shows me at a holistic view what my app is doing. So I have some availability zones that are calling in and just testing this particular app. And then as you can see here, I have different instances of this app running in different environments. So I have this instance and I have this instance, and they're both using the same SQL database. One's localhost, that's just for me testing it just now. But as you can see, like I have all this really, really, invaluable telemetry from a topological perspective. I can also change this into kind of like a more workflow based thing if that suits your needs. But at the end of the day, like it's super valuable to be able to see the flow of data between all the services that your app is using. And if I click on live metrics here, let me just do this. Let me just pin this to the side. Right, and as you can see, it'll say live metric stream is coming up, right? So as I'm going through here and I'm using this app, things are going to start to light up, like in my my requests and my request rates and things like that, in my dependency call rate. I know that it's kind of small. Let me zoom out a little bit. Just apologize that it's going to be a little bit smaller, but I want to make sure that everybody sees everything that's going on here. One thing that's super cool too is if, for instance, I mentioned earlier that I'm getting an error message, right? So I'm getting these error messages, and if I open this up, I have error messages here that I can see. Oh, index out of range, right? So this is in real time. So my application is actually throwing an exception, the backend is, and App Insights is actually tracking that exception and is actually showing me in real time what the exceptions are. So that's really, really impactful. And you'll take a look at that. I wonder why this particular exception is happening. So I can actually go into failures and look, like, for instance, I can look in the last hour. And here I could say, okay, well, it looks like this particular operation name, get heroes, is not working right. And there's the main exception is this argument out of range exception. So I can click that, and then it gives me this, which I think is really, really cool. And then I have like this transaction details of what all the things my app is doing. Okay, so a request came in, it hit the database, and then I threw an exception. That's strange. So I can take a look here and look at the index out of range exception. I can see this. I scroll down a little bit, and then I see a call stack, right? Anybody who's looked at call stacks a lot is like, okay, there might be some things here that are valuable, but I just want to look at my code. Well, I have adjust my code button. So I can click this, and then it actually shows, you just click here, the line number of where my code is actually failing. So I can actually go back to my source code and say, oh, line 57 of heroservice.cs is not working. So I can better triage my applications right now without having to get very far, which I think is really valuable. Cool. And there's all sorts of really interesting things that you can do as well with App Insights. Like, for instance, I can take a look at all this telemetry, and I can, at a glance, just start running queries against it. So, for instance, like, let me just, let's do this. Let's X out of this. I just want to create a new query. Let's say, for instance, I want to see who's using my app across the world. So I can just, and this is using a query markup language called KQL, Custom Query Language, which is how Log Analytics, which is the data mechanism for a lot of Azure Monitor stuff. This is how it's stored, and it's using this query mechanism to be able to work against it. So I want to take a look at all my requests. I want to summarize, and let's just go count, and let's just go by, let's go by country, right? So in the last 24 hours, who has gone to my app? Right. Let me just mute this person. Sorry about that for muting you. So as you can see here, I have, like, in the last 24 hours, these are all the people that have used my site. So that's really cool. So I could actually take this to a business user and say, look, these are all the places that people use our app, and they'll be like, okay, that's great. That's a table. That's not really valuable. But then I can say, okay, well, how about like a chart? And they're like, oh, bar charts are cool, but I really like donut charts. Like, could you like make a donut chart? And then you say, okay, well, I'm gonna send this over to the data designer. It's gonna take like 6 months for them to actually write up a donut chart. Or you can scroll down, and then you can change that here. It's like, okay, cool. So I have to go into this tool every single time if I want to see this report. Oh, not really. You can actually export it to Power BI. And then right here, I have a particular file, a Power BI query that I can actually embed into my report. And this data is now live in some report somewhere. So just imagine how long and how much time has been saved by something like that, right? So taking data that exists and getting a report for it almost instantaneously. So that's super, super valuable. Cool. All right, so I'm going to go back to the slides. I'll pause to give people the opportunity to ask any questions if they have any.
Isaac, I get a quick one. This may not be
Sure.
fair. So I just tried to do a similar thing to what you did against my data. And I have a whole bunch of I have a whole bunch of rows where I don't have a value for country or region. I mean, most of them do, but
yeah. So in some scenarios, depending on what country it is, Microsoft can't collect PII for that particular country.
Oh, the Germans.
Yeah. So
okay.
So in the situation where you're not getting data, there could be a handful of reasons. One, it could be cache data. One, it could be data that's being filtered out by some PI filters that App Insights has in place. Also, in general, from my experience, you're always going to get some data that isn't 100% like full. Like there's some data that's empty occasionally. But predominantly, you should see majority of data with data points with actually fully populated data in there.
Thanks.
No problem. All right. Okay. So on to the last part, and quick check, Jason and Bill, Veronica, how much time do I have? 10 minutes? 5 minutes? 1 minute?
You have, I mean, assuming you want to go, if you want to go like 15, 20 more minutes, that's all fine from my point of view.
Well, I just want to make sure that people aren't bored. Like maybe this is an opportunity for people to take naps. I know it's later in the day over on the East Coast, so, hopefully I can wake everybody up with this next part, right? So I have production issues. So give me a thumbs up or a hand raise or whatever in Teams if you've ever heard that in your professional development career. I'm looking. All right. So there are a few people here. That's good. So that means people
I've
are
heard
actually.
it about other people's apps.
Oh, okay. Only, not your apps though, right, Bill? Okay, that's fine. All right, cool. So, you know what? We've all heard I have production issues, or there's issues in production. We need to take a look at. There's a fire drill, whatever, right? So, what are some of the things that we can do, or what are some of the things that cause production issues? Well, first off, more than likely, anything can cause a production issue, right? But I think one of the things that's really important to call out is that there are some main things that cause typical production issues, whether it being data that's not, that exposes issues in our source code, different configuration differences per environment that may be causing issues with scaling, like maybe your app just can't handle the load, or really anything else. Maybe for instance, I worked at a company and their app went down because it was at a data center, and someone was doing maintenance on the data center and dropped a screwdriver and shorted out the whole rack, and their web app went down. That's something that wasn't accounted for in source code, wasn't accounted for. Like, things happen, humans happen, right? So really anything else can be, the cause of production issues. So what are our triage options? Right. So I think there's a handful of different options that exist for folks that allow you to get better assimilate to your issues that you're having in production. So in some scenarios, you can copy down some version of production data to some local or lower level environment, right? That's really, really valuable in some cases. Probably not the best approach in a lot of cases because of customer data or just the scale of the data that exists. Some companies or some individuals have the luxury of having like production staging environments where you can actually test things and kind of have a better fidelity view without kind of affecting production data. You can read logs if you hate your life. Like, you can read IIS logs or database logs or event logs if you really want to. And then you can do something like this. Give me a thumbs up if you've done this before. Attach the debugger in Visual Studio to production. All right, no one is thumbs upping, so that means that everybody here are liars. Cool. All right, so I think one thing that's really important to call out is we definitely don't want to do that. We do not want to be in a position where we're taking down our production applications to figure out what's going on. Because if anybody's done that, they know how many people are staying behind them. If they're at their desk and they're hacking away, trying to look at some stuff, and the production side is down, you have everybody and their grandmother there watching you. And that's not a good place to be when you're trying to figure out an issue, especially a complicated one. So there has to be a better option, right? Well, there is. It's called Snapshot Debugger. So Snapshot Debugger holistically gives you full stack trace, full locals window at the time of exception, in a Visual Studio debugging experience from Visual Studio from an exception that happened in Azure. Just think about that for a second. So you mean to tell me that I can actually take an exception that exists in Azure, and I can actually look at that exception and all the variables that exist for it from Visual Studio? No, that's not a thing. That can't be a thing. Well, this is what it looks like. So you can actually go, and I'll show you this in the Azure portal too. You can go through the Azure portal, click on a snapshot of an exception that existed, and go exactly and get a better understanding of what you're trying to do. There's a couple of, there's a call out, Gabriel, in the chat. So Snapshot Debugger is in preview for Linux apps in Azure. So this is a Windows only thing. Also, there are parts of Snapshot Debugger which are enterprise version of Visual Studio only. So if you have the professional or the community edition of Visual Studio, you're not going to get to party on all of the cool things that exist in Snapshot Debugger, but also going to kind of get you an idea of what you could get. So this is what it looks like, and as you can see, there's a lot of cool information here. So I want to show you actually in real life what it actually looks like. So let's actually open up. All right. So I'm going to go back into my failure section. I'm going to close out of here, and I'm going to go to this failure section again. I'm going to click on one of these. So as you can see here, a similar exception that happened in the fast, but I have this, right? I have this cool thing. Open snapshot or open debug snapshot. I can click on that. And then it's going to actually do is so one of the cool things with App Insights is that by default, most applications are now sent with PDB files. And those PDB files you can actually they can actually get extracted with some mechanisms to actually get a better understanding of what your source code looks like and kind of rebuild what your source code looks like. So as you can see here, there's some cool things going on. So I have a call stack. So I can actually look like multiple methods down, and I can actually see, okay, cool. I can see there's an exception, index out of range, index 3. I can see the exception itself. I can keep going down the list, line 57. There's like, it looks like source code. It's not actually, it's not official source code. It's decompiled source code, so it's not 100% accurate, but it gives you a pretty good understanding of what's going on, right? And then I have this ability to download a snapshot. So downloading that snapshot allows me to actually open a file in Visual Studio, which will give me the same experiences if I was debugging locally in that through an exception. These debug snapshots can get kind of big. So what I actually did is I downloaded one earlier today. So I'm going to open that up. So I'm going to go open in Visual Studio. Apologies. Open file. I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to open one of these files. It's going to give me this really friendly message saying this comes from an untrusted source. That untrusted source is Azure. So I'm just going to go ahead and click yes. And that's going to give me this diag session breakdown. And I think one of the things that's really, really important to call out is it gives you all sorts of really valuable information. Like I mentioned, this I downloaded the snapshot yesterday, so I can actually see the time of the exception. I can see the process name, so W3WP, which is the IIS process. And then I can debug with managed only. So if I click that, it's actually going to load all my symbols, and then it's actually going to open Visual Studio in a similar experience as to if it was to throw an exception. So let's look at my source code here and let's figure out what's going on. So whenever I run a search, I'm getting that exception, right? Like that index out of range exception, and I wonder why. So as you can see here, like I'm getting a list of heroes based on a particular name, and then I'm doing like this. So what do you think could be the cause of why I'm getting an exception? You can come off mute and tell me if you want.
How about if there's only 2 things in the list?
That's a pretty solid point. Like you should never be getting like a particular number of an array without checking the length of it first, right? So I'm getting the 4th item in an array, and there could be less than 4. And that's always going to throw an exception, right? So in that situation, I can see here, I can get faster to my solution. And again, I was able to triage an issue really, really quickly. I actually have hover over. So like, for instance, right? So if I go name, it shows me like, oh, this is what the parameter was at this particular exception time, right? So super, super valuable stuff. And like I said, there are other things that you can do with Snapshot Debugger if you have an enterprise version of Visual Studio. I do not have an enterprise version of Visual Studio anymore because I no longer work at Microsoft. I don't get things for free. But you have the ability to do things like attaching to Azure and not taking down your production applications, but still getting real-time debugging. That's something that you can do. You can also do things like it's you know how I mentioned a little bit earlier, like don't ever attach to production. Like this is attaching to production. So it takes it takes a shadow copy of W3WP, the IIS process, and connects to that. So all the traffic flows both ways. So you have that ability to actually debug a live Azure instance without it actually affecting production. And one quick thing, you know, if you don't believe what I just said, like I did a video on .NET probably like 2 years ago now that actually shows how to do this sort of thing. So please take a look at that. There'll be a link to it at the end of this. And yeah, that's kind of my talk. So I really appreciate, you know, Bill, Veronica, and Jason for inviting me to chat with our lovely folks of Boston. Hopefully it's not too late that you're taking a nap and you're excited to learn some more things about Azure and App Insight. So let me paste this particular, scroll down. This is a link for all of so a bunch of valuable things about App Insight. So the source code for the app that you saw is there. Some interesting docs are there. The video that I did for Channel 9 is there as well. And yeah, so please take a look at App Insights, you know, and if you have any questions, I'd love to continue the conversation on Twitter. Yeah, we can have questions for the rest of the time, or you can tell me how terrible of a presentation this was. But I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for having me.
Jason, Isaac, that was terrific. That was really terrific. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
A quick question. Two things. Two quick questions. One, we had observed a lot of times that when we had snapshot debugging turned on, that it seemed to be introducing additional load to the servers. And so we wound up having to turn it off because we didn't like what we were seeing.
Sure.
Do you expect that that be a surprise or expected?
I mean, so in all honesty, there's going to be some performance degradation using Snapshot Debugger. The last thing that I've ever heard from the debugger team is that it's less than 5% performance degradation. That can be a lot for a lot of applications, right? 5%. I personally have seen it running on really big applications, and performance using it was not terrible. But again, I think it's probably one of those your mileage may vary sort of things. It also could be that, your application could be doing something really intensive, and Snapshot Debugger in the process of, having to kind of decompile that source code does take a little bit of effort. But from my experience, it's around 5%. At least that's what I've been told. And I've never really seen it fall down in practice. But I mean, there's always an example of everything, right?
I think they try to limit like how many snapshots they take if they see the same exception, but we found that wasn't working right. We'd see the same thing over and over again. But that's neither here nor there. The other question I wanted to ask was about profiling. I know that's also a feature, but we found a lot of times the profiles that we wind up downloading aren't very helpful. They just, it's like all .NET code. There's none of our code in the profile, and we can't like figure out, okay, why are we slow? Because it's none of our code.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to call out with any profiling, right, is that more than likely you're going to have to get to this weird state of having to deal with unmanaged and managed code at the same time, right? And I think that, depending on can you give me a little bit of insight as to what the technology stack of your app is? Is it framework?
It's right. .NET Framework, SQL Azure, with a lot of other Azure services.
Sure.
Not the most latest, like 4.6 timeframe.
Yeah, and I'd imagine one thing too is that, and this is obviously not fair to anybody, but I imagine if you were to have it be like 4.7 or 4.7.2, you might get a better profiling experience. But I think one of the things to call out is that, profiling is an art. And I think one of the reason why a lot of developers, including myself and you, have jobs is our ability to kind of look through the noise and get with the tools that we have and get a better understanding of what we can do. But yeah, no, I definitely hear your point about profiling not being accurate, not being accurate, but profile not giving you enough contextual information. And that's why I think Snapshot Debugger is really interesting too, is because it does give you that fidelity in exceptions. But again, I think it's one of those things where your mileage is definitely going to vary. If you do want to have for kind of continued conversation, I could potentially introduce you to people in the product groups, to kind of maybe drill down as to how we can resolve your use case, right?
Oh, thanks.
That might be an option too.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. I'm kind of scrolling up through the chat and I see Gabriel asked a question that I love. So I'm just going to answer real quick. So I know Elastic has many overlapping capabilities in doing what AI is doing, right? So I'm going to talk about Elastic for like 1 second. So if nobody cares, please just shut your ears. So Elastic Observability, I think, is really interesting because it gives you kind of that, one stop to do a lot of things. Like say you have, maybe you're using some hybrid cloud approach. Maybe you have stuff in Google Cloud. Maybe you have stuff on premise. Maybe you have stuff in Azure as well. So what Elastic Observability allows you to do is coalesce all that data into one place and be able to search on it really, really effectively. So the number one value prop of Elastic is that we are a search company. So getting answers to your queries as fast as possible and as accurate as possible is why it's why we have these products. So I think the long and short of it is, when would I offer one or the other? I think if you have all of your stuff in Azure, don't go outside of Azure. Like don't get New Relic or don't even get Elastic. I would love for you to get Elastic for a lot of reasons, but I think at the end of the day, if all of your stuff is in Azure, just use the tools that Azure has, because I think, Azure Monitor and App Insights does a great job. But as you start to have like more and more like external data sources that are away from your app, like maybe you have data that sits somewhere in some other system, or maybe you have an app that runs in 3 different clouds. Like, good luck trying to coalesce all that data in a meaningful way using like one of the cloud providers' APM tools. So you need something like Elastic Observability to be able to do that. I hope that answered your question. It wasn't too much marketing speak, but
thank you.
Cool. All right, so Tim has a question. Do you have any recommendations about data sampling with App Insights? When to use it, when not to use it? So I didn't talk about data sampling, but I think there's a really good topic to talk about briefly, right? So I mentioned a little bit earlier that you kind of pay for the in and out of your data, right? Up to 5 gigabytes is free, but after that, it can at times get expensive, right? Especially if you have a high trafficked app. What data sampling allows you to do is it allows you to kind of, I guess, prune similar requests in a way. So like, say for instance, I have 30 web requests that are all the same. What data sampling allows you to do is filter out them by a percentage. Like, maybe I only want to keep half of them or 2/3 of them or whatever. The issue with data sampling, as one would imagine, is that it doesn't byte for byte compare different pieces. Like, it takes similarities and prunes them. So in situations where I think data sampling might be really valuable is that if your app is really chatty and is creating lots and lots of telemetry, like, highly recommended that you take a look at some data sampling options. Otherwise, you're going to be paying, $2.30 per gigabyte per month for lots and lots of gigabytes. So when not to use it, if you're nowhere near that 5, don't data sample, like, period. Like, it's not worth it to you. Also, in scenarios where data sampling is not valuable, is if you're seeing data, the data that's coming through in your sample isn't matching up with the experience of your users, then that's definitely a situation where data is being sampled out that you definitely don't want it to be. Hopefully that was helpful. I know that's probably a little bit of your mileage may vary too, but I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is your mileage may vary, and it's about tools in the tool belt to help you be more successful. So, and also just another plug. Veronica mentioned it. I'm speaking at .NET Conf too, so I'm going to be talking about GitHub Actions, .NET, and Azure. So please take a look at that. I did a similar talk last year. I'm doing like the next version of that talk, which is a bit more advanced topics. But if you like DevOps, if you like .NET, if you like Azure, definitely check out that talk. That's on day 2 of .NET Conf, or maybe day 3. I don't remember. It's during .NET Conf. Watch the whole thing. Watch all 24 hours, 3 days a week, 3 days of it. Cool. So if anybody didn't have any other questions, I again want to thank the organizers and thank you folks for tuning in. This has been great. And yeah, again, if you have any other questions or you want to follow me to, like Bill said, I'm very high energy on the tweets. So Isaac R11 is where you can find me. And yeah, this has been a pleasure. So thank you again.
Isaac, thank you very kindly. This was really excellent. Some really great insights. So thank you for that. Folks, you have in the chat area, you can follow the link to get the resources from the talk and more info on Isaac. And then we have Doug and David coming up in the next 2 Boston Azures. And Ignite is going on if you want to tap into that. That started today, and it's a couple more days this week, I think. That's free. It's streamed. And then Granite State Code Camp Saturday, and then .NET Conf next week. Get your nerd on. There's plenty of stuff going on. With that, anybody have any final comments or?
One last question. How do we get if one of my colleagues wasn't able to see the whole thing, and I know we recorded it, how do we get to the recording?
Yeah, that's
YouTube.com. You pay me some money.
Yeah, youtube.com/Boston Azure, and it'll probably be posted tomorrow. Might be posted as early as the morning, but usually it takes about 1 day to get it posted. But you can find it there, bostonazure.com. youtube.com/Boston Azure. It's also, there's a link in the meeting invite too.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Yeah, and I'll tweet it out with the, if you follow Boston Azure Twitter handle.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.